The wind cut through Montana's Blackstone Valley like a blade, carrying with it the scent of snow and desperation. In the dying light of December 1887, two lives were about to collide in the most unexpected way: a scarred rancher who'd lost everything he'd ever loved, and a 17-year-old girl standing on an auction block with nothing but the thin dress on her back and ice in her veins. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The auction house in Copper Ridge reeked of tobacco smoke and unwashed bodies. Men in worn coats shuffled their boots against the wooden floor, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. At the back of the room, Caleb Morrison pulled his hat lower over his face, the brim casting shadows across the jagged scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a permanent reminder of the fire that had taken his wife and unborn child 3 years ago. He hadn't come here looking for a bride. Hell, he hadn't come looking for anything except maybe a bottle of whiskey and a reason to forget that Christmas was only 2 weeks away. But when the auctioneer's voice boomed across the room, announcing the next lot, Caleb's attention snapped to the makeshift stage. The girl couldn't have been more than 17, her auburn hair hanging in matted waves around a face that was all sharp angles and hollow cheeks. Her dress, if you could call the tattered gray fabric that hung loose on her small frame, and her bare feet were purple with cold. But it was her eyes that stopped Caleb dead in his tracks. Green as spring grass and hard as flint, they swept across the crowd with a mixture of defiance and calculation that reminded him of a cornered wildcat. "This here's Evangeline Hartwell," the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying that false cheerfulness that made Caleb's stomach turn. "Fresh from back east, good for housework, cooking, and whatever else a man might need." A few men in the crowd chuckled, and Caleb saw the girl's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Her stepfather, Jeremiah Hartwell, needs to settle some debts, so he's looking for a good Christian man to take responsibility for the girl. Starting bid is $50. Caleb had seen enough auctions to know how this would go. The girl would be sold to whoever had the deepest pockets and the loosest morals, and she'd disappear into some homestead where her screams wouldn't carry to the nearest neighbor. He'd told himself 100 times that the world was full of suffering he couldn't fix, that he'd used up all his heroism in the war and had nothing left to give. But those eyes, those damn green eyes that held more fight than fear. $50, called out Ezra Hutchins, a thick-set man who ran a logging operation up north. Caleb knew Hutchins by reputation, 3 wives, all of whom had died under mysterious circumstances. $60, came another voice. Caleb felt his hand moving almost of its own accord, reaching for the roll of bills in his jacket pocket. The money was meant for winter supplies, for the feed that would keep his cattle alive through the harsh months ahead. His ranch, what was left of it, was barely holding on as it was. $75, Hutchins called out, and Caleb could see the predatory gleam in the man's eyes. The girl, Evangeline, hadn't moved from her position on the stage, but Caleb noticed her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. A purple bruise darkened her left cheek, and there were finger-shaped marks on her wrists that told their own story about how she'd ended up here. $100, Caleb heard himself say, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a gunshot. Heads turned to look at him, and he felt the familiar burn of their stares on his scarred face. He'd learned to live with the looks, the mixture of pity and revulsion that people couldn't quite hide when they saw what remained of Caleb Morrison after the fire had finished with him. $100 from the gentleman in the back, the auctioneer announced, and Caleb could hear the excitement in his voice. This was turning into the kind of bidding war that would be talked about for months. $125, Hutchins countered, his voice tight with irritation. Caleb pulled out his entire roll of bills, everything he had in the world, except for the few dollars hidden in his cabin for true emergencies. He'd bought the ranch with his Army pay and a loan from the bank, and he'd been barely scraping by ever since. The money in his hand represented the difference between making it through the winter and losing everything to foreclosure. $200, he called out, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. The silence that followed was deafening. $200 was more than most men in Copper Ridge saw in 6 months. Hutchins' face had gone red, and he was whispering urgently to another man beside him, probably trying to scrape together enough for a counterbid. For the first time since she'd been pushed onto the stage, Evangeline looked directly at Caleb. Their eyes met across the smoky room, and he saw something flicker in her expression, not gratitude exactly, but a kind of wary recognition. She was smart enough to know that $200 bought more than just her freedom from Hutchins. It bought her complete dependence on a stranger with a ruined face and unknown intentions. $200, going once, the auctioneer called out. Scanning the crowd for any last-minute bids, Caleb found himself holding his breath, though he couldn't say whether he was hoping someone would outbid him or praying they wouldn't. The rational part of his mind was screaming that this was madness. He could barely take care of himself, let alone a girl who'd been through God knows what. But the part of him that had carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire, that had pulled his dying wife from the burning cabin, even though it was already too late, that part wouldn't let him walk away. Going twice. Hutchins made one last desperate attempt, shouting out $225. But his voice cracked with uncertainty, and everyone in the room could tell he didn't have the money to back it up. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Sold to the gentleman in the back. For $200. Caleb made his way through the crowd, men stepping aside to let him pass. Up close, Evangeline was even smaller than she'd appeared from the back of the room, the top of her head barely reaching his shoulder. But there was nothing fragile about the way she held herself, nothing broken in the set of her spine, despite everything she'd clearly endured. "Name's Caleb Morrison," he said quietly, pulling off his coat and draping it around her shoulders. The heavy wool swallowed her slight frame, but she pulled it tight without a word of thanks. "I know who you are," she replied, her voice hoarse but clear. "You're the man who lost his wife in the fire. The one who tried to save her." The words hit him like a physical blow. He'd forgotten how small towns worked, how everyone knew everyone else's business and tragedies. "That's right," he said simply. She studied his face for a long moment, her green eyes taking in every detail of his scars. "Good," she said finally. "A man who'd run into a burning building for someone he loved isn't likely to hurt someone he's paid good money for." It was a pragmatic assessment, devoid of sentiment or romance, and somehow that made it easier to bear than if she'd offered him pity or false comfort. This wasn't a fairy tale rescue. It was a business transaction with a young woman who'd learned to think in terms of survival rather than sentiment. The auctioneer approached them with a ledger and a pen, his face creased in an oily smile. "Just need you to sign here, Mr. Morrison, and the transaction is complete. The girl's your responsibility now, legal and binding." Caleb counted out the bills, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was doing. $200. $200 for a human being, for a life that would now be tied to his, whether either of them wanted it or not. As he signed his name to the papers, he caught sight of a man watching from the corner of the room, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of soft hands that spoke of a life spent counting money rather than earning it. The man's eyes were fixed on Evangeline with an intensity that made Caleb's skin crawl, and when their gazes met, the stranger's expression shifted to something that looked almost like rage. "That's him," Evangeline whispered, following Caleb's gaze. "That's Jeremiah Hartwell, my stepfather. The man who'd sold her. The man who'd put her on that stage like a piece of livestock to settle his debts." Caleb felt a familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury that had driven him to charge enemy lines during the war, that had made him tear at burning timbers. With his bare hands, Hartwell approached them with the kind of predatory, confidence that came from years of getting his way through intimidation and manipulation. "Mr. Morrison," he said, his voice smooth as silk, "I trust you'll take good care of my stepdaughter. She's been through quite an ordeal, losing her mother and all." "I'm sure she has," Caleb replied, his voice flat and dangerous. Up close, he could see the family resemblance, or rather, the complete lack of it. Evangeline's delicate features and auburn hair bore no resemblance to Hartwell's heavy-set frame and thinning brown hair. "She's a good girl," Hartwell continued, seemingly oblivious to the tension radiating from both Caleb and Evangeline. "A bit headstrong, perhaps, but nothing a firm hand can't correct. I've tried to teach her proper respect for authority, but I'm afraid she's proven somewhat resistant to traditional methods of discipline." The bruise on Evangeline's cheek seemed to darken before Caleb's eyes, and he had to consciously unclench his fists to keep from reaching for the gun at his hip. "I'm sure she'll be just fine," he said through gritted teeth. Hartwell's smile widened, and Caleb caught a glimpse of gold teeth that spoke of wealth built on the backs of others suffering. Of course. Well, I'll leave you to get acquainted. Evangeline, remember what we discussed about gratitude and obedience." The threat in his words was subtle but unmistakable, and Caleb saw Evangeline's jaw tighten in response. Whatever Hartwell had done to her, whatever he'd threatened, it was enough to keep her silent even now. As Hartwell walked away, pocketing the money from Evangeline's sale, Caleb felt the weight of what he'd done settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He'd just bought a human being, a 17-year-old girl who'd been beaten and sold by the man who was supposed to protect her. And now she was his responsibility, his burden, his... Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I won't be in any trouble," Evangeline said quietly, interrupting his spiraling thoughts. "I can cook and clean, and I know enough about ranching to be useful. I won't ask for anything beyond room and board." "That's not," Caleb started, then stopped. What was he going to say? That he hadn't bought her for her domestic skills? That he'd acted on impulse and emotion rather than logic? That he had no idea what he was doing or how they were going to make this work? Instead, he simply nodded and gestured toward the door. "Come on, let's get you somewhere warm." As they stepped out into the bitter December night, Caleb Morrison had no idea that he'd just set in motion a chain of events that would transform not only his life and Evangeline's, but the entire Blackstone Valley. All he knew was that the girl walking beside him deserved better than what the world had given her so far. And maybe, just maybe, he was still capable of being the kind of man who could provide it. The wagon ride to Caleb's ranch stretched through 15 miles of frozen wilderness, the only sounds the crunch of wheels on snow-packed dirt and the steady breathing of his 2 horses. Evangeline sat beside him on the wooden bench, wrapped in his coat and a wool blanket he'd retrieved from behind the seat. She hadn't spoken since they'd left Copper Ridge, and Caleb found himself grateful for the silence. What the hell had he been thinking? The question had been circling his mind for the past hour, growing louder with each mile that separated them from town. $200, his entire savings, gone in a moment of what could only be described as temporary insanity brought on by a pair of green eyes and a stubborn chin. The smart thing would have been to walk away. The smart thing would have been to let Hutchins or one of the other men take her, to tell himself that the world was full of suffering he couldn't fix. He'd learned that lesson the hard way when he'd watched his wife die in his arms, when he'd buried their unborn child alongside her in the frozen ground of winter. But here he was, with a 17-year-old girl who'd been sold like livestock, heading toward a ranch that was barely profitable enough to keep one person alive, let alone 2. How much further? Evangeline asked, breaking the silence that had stretched between them like a held breath. "Another hour, maybe less," Caleb replied, his voice rougher than he'd intended. The cold was making his throat tight, and the scar. Tissue on his face always ached more when the temperature dropped. She nodded and pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. In the moonlight, he could see that her lips were still tinged blue with cold, despite the layers of wool and his heavy coat. Her feet were still bare. He'd forgotten about that in his haste to get her away from the auction house. "We'll stop at Brennan's store," he said, more to himself than to her. "Get you some proper shoes and a warmer dress." "I don't need charity," she said quickly, and there was steel in her voice that reminded him of his wife's stubborn pride. "I can work for whatever I need." "It's not charity," Caleb said, though he wasn't entirely sure what it was. "You can't work if you're laid up with frostbite." The store was a small building that looked like it might blow away in the next strong wind, but a thin line of smoke rising from the chimney suggested that old Tom Brennan was still awake. Caleb tied the horses to the hitching post and helped Evangeline down from the wagon, pretending not to notice how her legs shook when her feet touched the frozen ground. Tom Brennan was a grizzled man in his 60s who'd been running the store for longer than anyone could remember. He looked up from his ledger when they entered, his eyes taking in Evangeline's bare feet and tattered dress with the kind of understanding that came from years of seeing people at their worst. "Evening, Caleb," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "What can I do for you folks?" "Need shoes," Caleb said simply. "And a warm dress, maybe a coat." Tom nodded and disappeared into the back room, returning with an armload of clothes and a pair of sturdy leather boots. "These should fit," he said, setting them on the counter. "The dress belonged to my daughter before she got married and moved to California. Never could bring myself to throw it out." The dress was a simple brown wool, nothing fancy but well made and warm. The boots were men's boots, but they were small. Enough that they might work for a girl Evangeline's size. "How much?" Caleb asked, reaching for what was left of his money. $20 for the lot, Tom said, then paused. "Actually, make it 15. The dress wasn't doing anybody any good sitting in my back room." Caleb counted out the bills, grateful for the old man's discretion. Tom had been around long enough to know that there were times when asking too many questions only made things worse for everyone involved. "There's a room behind the store where the lady can change," Tom offered, and Evangeline nodded gratefully. While she was gone, Tom poured Caleb a cup of coffee from the pot that seemed to be permanently brewing on his stove. "Heard there was some excitement at the auction house tonight," he said carefully. "News travels fast," Caleb replied, taking a sip of the bitter coffee and feeling it burn away some of the cold that had settled in his bones. "Always does in a small town." Tom studied Caleb's face, taking in the scars that the firelight made even more pronounced. "You know what you're doing, son?" It was a fair question, and Caleb wished he had a fair answer. "No," he said finally. "I don't have the first idea what I'm doing." Tom nodded as if this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. "Well, that's honest at least. Most men would try to convince themselves they had it all figured out. I couldn't let Hutchins take her," Caleb said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "You know what he would have done to her." "I know," Tom said quietly. "And I know you're a good man, Caleb Morrison. Been knowing it since you came back from the war. But good intentions don't put food on the table or keep a roof over your head." "I'll figure it out," Caleb said, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. When Evangeline emerged from the back room, she looked like a completely different person. The brown wool dress fit her perfectly, and the boots, while clearly too large, were sturdy enough to keep her feet warm and dry. She'd managed to tame her hair into a neat braid, and with the worst of the dirt washed from her face, Caleb could see that she was actually quite pretty in a sharp-featured, no-nonsense way. "Thank you," she said to Tom, her voice formal but genuine. "I'll pay you back when I can." "No need," Tom said, waving away her offer. "Just take care of yourself, miss." Back in the wagon, the atmosphere felt different somehow. Maybe it was the warm clothes, Or maybe it was the simple act of being treated with kindness by a stranger, but Evangeline seemed to have relaxed slightly. She still sat ramrod straight on the bench beside him, but she wasn't quite as tense as she'd been before. "Tell me about the ranch," she said as they turned onto the narrow track that led to Caleb's property. "It's nothing fancy," he said, which was putting it mildly. "About 200 acres, mostly grazing land. Got maybe 30 head of cattle, a few horses. House isn't much, but it's solid." "How long have you had it?" "Bought it with my army pay when I came back from the war. That was 4 years ago." He didn't mention that he'd bought it planning to raise a family there, that he'd imagined children running through the fields, and his wife hanging laundry on the line he'd strung between 2 oak trees. "What happened to your wife?" The question was asked matter-of-factly, without the usual awkwardness that people displayed when they brought up his tragedy. "House fire," he said simply. 3 years ago this February. I was in town getting supplies. By the time I got back, it was too late." "I'm sorry," she said, and he could tell she meant it. "What about your mother?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. "Consumption," Evangeline replied. 2 years ago. She married Jeremiah when I was 14, after my father died. Thought he'd take care of us." Her voice carried a bitterness that spoke of hard-earned wisdom. "Turns out he was more interested in my mother's life insurance policy than in taking care of anybody." The pieces were starting to fall into place. Jeremiah Hartwell had married a widow with a teenage daughter, waited for his wife to die, then sold the daughter to pay off his debts. It was a story as old as time and as ugly as sin. "He's been trying to get rid of me for months," Evangeline continued. "First he tried to marry me off to some old man in Kansas City, but I ran away. Then he tried to send me to work in a factory back east, but I wouldn't go. Finally, he decided to just sell me. Outright." "How did you end up at the auction house?" "He told me we were going to visit his sister in Copper Ridge, packed me into the wagon, drove me to town, and handed me over to the auctioneer like I was a piece of livestock." Her voice was steady, but Caleb could hear the anger underneath. "Said if I tried to run or caused any trouble, he'd have me arrested for theft." "Theft of what?" "My mother's jewelry. He claimed I stole it, but it was left to me in her will. Not that anybody would believe a 17-year-old girl over a respectable businessman." The ranch house came into view as they crested a small hill, and Caleb felt a familiar mixture of pride and shame at the sight of it. The house was small but well built, with a steep roof designed to shed snow and a wide front porch that caught the morning sun. It wasn't much, but it was his dot. The barn was larger than the house, a necessity on a working ranch. The corral was empty. Now he'd moved the horses to the winter pasture closer to the house, but come spring, it would be full of the activity that made ranch life worthwhile. "It's beautiful," Evangeline said, and Caleb looked at her in surprise. "It's falling apart," he said honestly. "The roof needs work, the barn door doesn't close properly, and the well needs to be dug deeper." "It's still beautiful," she insisted. "It's yours. Nobody can take it away from you or sell it out from under you." There was something in her voice that made Caleb realize that home had always been a temporary thing for her, something that could be lost or taken away without warning. The ranch might be rough around the edges, but it was permanent in a way that nothing else in her life had been. He helped her down from the wagon and led her to the front door, suddenly conscious of how the house must look to someone seeing it for the first time. The furniture was sparse and practical, built for function rather than comfort. The walls were bare, except for a few hooks for coats and hats. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floors, no touches of femininity or warmth. "I'll sleep in the barn," he said, setting her small bundle of belongings on the kitchen table. "You can have the bedroom." "No," she said firmly. "I won't turn you out of your own bed. I can sleep on the floor or make a bed in the kitchen. I'm used to making do." "You're not sleeping on the floor," Caleb said, his voice carrying a finality. That brooked no argument. "You'll take the bedroom, and that's the end of it." For a moment, it looked like she might argue, but then she nodded. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything. I know you didn't have to do what you did tonight." "Yeah, well," Caleb said, suddenly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "We'll figure out the rest as we go." As he made his way to the barn with an armload of blankets, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a turn into uncharted territory. He'd bought himself a wife in all but name, taken responsibility for a girl who'd been through more hardship than most people saw in a lifetime, and committed himself to a future he couldn't even begin to imagine. The barn was cold and smelled of hay and horse leather, familiar scents that usually brought him comfort. But tonight, as he made a bed for himself in the empty stall where he used to keep his plow horses, all he could think about was the girl in his house and the impossible situation they'd both found themselves in. Tomorrow he'd have to figure out how to make this work, how to provide for two people instead of one, how to navigate the complicated business of living with a woman who wasn't his wife, how to protect her from men like Jeremiah Hartwell, who saw her as nothing more than a commodity to be bought and sold. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Caleb Morrison wasn't alone. And despite everything, the uncertainty, the financial strain, the sheer impossibility of it all, that thought was oddly comforting as he pulled the blankets up around his shoulders and tried to find sleep in the cold darkness of the barn. Dawn broke over the Blackstone Valley with the kind of bitter clarity that only came with deep winter. Caleb woke to the sound of his cattle lowing in the distance, their voices carrying across the frozen pasture like a mournful song. He'd slept poorly, his dreams filled with images of green eyes and auction blocks, of fires that consumed everything he'd ever cared about. The barn was colder than a tomb, his breath forming white clouds in the air as he rolled out of his makeshift bed. Every muscle in his body ached from sleeping on the hard-packed earth, and the scar tissue on his face felt tight and painful in the frigid air. He'd forgotten how much the cold affected his old injuries, how the damaged skin pulled and burned when the temperature dropped below freezing. As he pulled on his boots and coat, Caleb found himself wondering what he'd find when he went to the house. Would Evangeline still be there, or would she have slipped away in the night like a ghost? The thought surprised him with its intensity. He'd known her for less than 12 hours, but the idea of finding the house empty filled him with something that felt uncomfortably like panic. The kitchen window glowed with warm lamplight as he approached the house, and he could smell something that made his stomach clench with hunger. When had he last eaten? Yesterday afternoon, maybe, before he'd ridden into town with nothing more ambitious in mind than buying supplies and drowning his sorrows in whatever rotgut whiskey the saloon was serving. He knocked on his own front door, feeling foolish but not wanting to startle her by walking in unannounced. The door opened to reveal Evangeline, fully dressed and looking like she'd been up for hours. Her hair was pinned back in a practical bun, and she wore a flour-dusted apron over the brown wool dress. "Good morning," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "I hope you don't mind. I found some eggs in the chicken coop and made breakfast." The kitchen table was set for two, with plates of scrambled eggs, thick slices of bacon, and biscuits that looked like they'd stepped out of a picture book. A pot of coffee sat steaming on the stove, and the whole house smelled like a home instead of the bachelor's quarters it had been for the past 3 years. "You didn't have to do this," Caleb said, though his stomach was already growling at the sight of real food. "I wanted to," she replied, pouring coffee into 2 mismatched cups. "I don't like being idle, and I figured you'd be hungry after sleeping in the barn." They ate in companionable silence, and Caleb found himself studying her face in the morning light. The bruise on her cheek was already fading from purple to yellow-green, and without the desperate edge that had marked her features at the auction house, she looked younger somehow. more vulnerable despite the competent way she'd taken charge of his kitchen. "This is good," he said, indicating the food. "Really good. My mother taught me to cook," Evangeline said, a shadow passing across her features. "She said a woman who could cook would never starve, no matter what else happened to her. Smart woman, she was. Too smart to have married Jeremiah Hartwell, but grief makes people do foolish things." Caleb knew something about that. Grief had made him buy a girl at an auction, had made him spend his last $200 on a stranger's freedom. But looking at Evangeline now, her chin set with determination as she planned their day, he found it hard to regret his impulse. "I'll need to check on the cattle this morning," he said. "Make sure they made it through the night without any trouble. The cold snap caught us early this year." "I'll come with you," she said immediately. "I know horses and cattle. My father had a small ranch in Colorado before he died." "You don't have to. I want to learn about this place," she interrupted. "If I'm going to be living here, I need to understand how it works." There was something in her tone that suggested this wasn't negotiable, and Caleb found himself nodding. "All right. But you'll need warmer clothes. It's going to be brutal out there." She disappeared into the bedroom and emerged wearing every piece of clothing she owned layered one on top of the other. The effect was comical. She looked like a small, overstuffed scarecrow, but Caleb could see the practical thinking behind it. The morning was indeed brutal, with a wind that cut through even the heaviest coats and a sky that promised more snow before the day was out. They saddled 2 horses from the small remuda Caleb kept near the house, and he watched with growing surprise as Evangeline handled her mount with the easy confidence of someone who'd grown up around horses. "You weren't lying about knowing ranch work," he said as they rode toward the winter pasture. "I never lie," she replied, and there was something in her voice that made him believe her. "Lying is a luxury I've never been able to afford." The cattle were huddled together in the shelter of a stand of pine trees, their breath-forming clouds in the frigid air. Caleb counted them automatically 32 head, all present and accounted for. They were a mixed bunch, mostly longhorns, with a few Herefords he'd bought from a rancher who was selling out and moving back east. "They look thin," Evangeline observed, and Caleb felt a familiar knot of worry tighten in his stomach. "The grazing's been poor this year," he admitted. "Not enough rain in the spring, and the grass never came back properly after the drought, too. Summers ago, what about hay?" "I've got some, but not enough to get them through if the winter runs long." He didn't mention that he'd been planning to use the money he'd spent on her to buy additional feed. Some things were better left unsaid. They rode the fence line, checking for breaks or places where the wire had been damaged by the cold. It was tedious work, but necessary. A gap in the fence could mean losing cattle to predators, or having them wander off and freeze to death in some distant gully. "Tell me about your neighbors," Evangeline said as they worked. "Are they likely to cause trouble?" It was a surprisingly practical question, and Caleb found himself reassessing his opinion of her intelligence. She wasn't just thinking about the immediate challenges of ranch life. She was already considering the longer-term implications of their situation. The closest neighbor is Marcus Webb, about 5 miles south. He's a good man, keeps to himself mostly. His wife died last year, and he's been struggling to keep his place running with just his teenage son to help him. What about the others? There's a big spread to the east owned by a man named Harrison Blake. He's got political connections and enough money to buy half the county if he wanted to. His ranch is more like a small town, dozens of hands, thousands of head of cattle. Is he friendly? Caleb considered the question. He's ambitious. The kind of man who sees every other rancher as either a potential asset or a threat. So far, I've been too small for him to notice, but that could change. And to the west? That's where it gets complicated. Caleb pulled his horse to a stop and pointed toward a ridge of hills that rose from the valley floor like sleeping giants. Those hills are full of men who don't much care for the law. Rustlers mostly, but some worse than that. They don't bother anyone who can't afford to be bothered, but they keep an eye on things. Meaning they might see me as a target? Meaning they might see you as an opportunity, Caleb said grimly. A woman alone, even one with a husband to protect her, is always going to be vulnerable out here. They finished their circuit of the ranch. In silence, both lost in their own thoughts. The sun was high by the time they returned to the house, and Caleb could feel the weight of unspoken questions pressing down on him like a physical force. "We need to talk," he said as they unsaddled their horses, "about what happens next." Evangeline nodded, and they walked back to the house together. The kitchen felt warm and welcoming after the bitter cold of the morning, and Caleb found himself grateful for the simple pleasure of a fire crackling in the stove. "I've been thinking about our situation," Evangeline said, pouring herself a cup of coffee from the pot that seemed to stay permanently warm. "And I think we need to be practical about this." "Practical how?" "You spent $200 on me last night. That's more money than most people see in a year, and I'm guessing it was money you couldn't afford to lose." She met his eyes steadily, and he saw no shame in her gaze, only clear-eyed assessment. "I owe you that money, plus room and board, plus whatever it costs to keep me fed and clothed." "That's not how this works," Caleb said, though he wasn't entirely sure how it did work. "Then tell me how it does work," she challenged. "Because right now, I'm a burden you've taken on out of pity or guilt or whatever noble impulse made you. Bid on me. That's not sustainable for either of us." "It wasn't pity," Caleb said, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. "Then what was it?" He struggled to find the words, to explain the complex mixture of emotions that had driven him to spend his last dollar on a stranger's freedom. "I couldn't let them have you," he said finally. "Men like Hutchins, they don't see women as people. They see them as things to be used up and thrown away. And you're different? I hope so." She studied his face for a long moment, her green eyes searching for something he couldn't name. "All right," she said finally. "Let's say you're different. Let's say you're everything you appear to be, a decent man who acted on impulse to save someone he saw as being in trouble." "What now?" "Now we figure out how to make this work," Caleb said. "I need help running this place, and you need somewhere safe to live. Maybe we can make it a partnership instead of ... whatever this is." "A partnership," she repeated, and he could hear her turning the word over in her mind. "What kind of partnership? You work the ranch with me. We split the profits, if there are any. You get half of whatever we make, and you can save up enough money to go wherever you want when you're ready." "And if I'm never ready?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither of them was quite ready to cross. Caleb found himself thinking about his empty house, about the silence that had been his only companion for 3 years, about the way the kitchen had felt this morning, alive with purpose and the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with another human being. "Then I guess we keep being partners," he said. "What about the other thing?" she asked, and he could see color rising in her cheeks despite her matter-of-fact tone. "What other thing?" "The thing that men usually want from women they buy at auction houses." The words hit him like a physical blow, and he felt his own face burning with embarrassment and something that might have been anger. "I didn't buy you for that," he said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite identify. "I know," she said quietly, "but other people might assume you did, and that could cause problems for both of us." She was right, of course. In a place like the Blackstone Valley, where everyone knew everyone else's business, there would be assumptions made about their relationship, assumptions that could make life difficult for both of them if they weren't careful. "We'll tell people we're married," Caleb said impulsively. "It's not that unusual for men to go back east to find wives, especially men who've been widowed. That's lying." "It's protecting both of us," he corrected. "And it's nobody's business but ours what the real arrangement is. And if someone wants to see a marriage certificate, then we'll get one." The words came out before he could stop them, and they both stared at each other in shock. "You'd marry me?" Evangeline asked, and there was something in her voice that he couldn't quite read. "If it would protect you, yes." He meant it, he realized with surprise. It would be a marriage in name only, just a piece of paper to keep people from asking questions. "And if I wanted more than that someday?" "Then we'd figure that out when the time came." She nodded slowly, and he could see her working through the implications of what he was proposing. "It's not a terrible plan," she said finally. "But there's something you need to know first." "What's that?" "I'm not some helpless victim you need to save," she said, and there was steel in her voice that reminded him of the girl who'd stood on the auction block with ice in her veins. "I survived 2 years with Jeremiah Hartwell. I survived being sold like livestock. I can survive whatever else life throws at me." "I never thought you were helpless," Caleb said, and he meant it. "Helpless girls don't last 5 minutes in places like this." "Good," she said, and for the first time since he'd met her, she smiled. It was a small smile, cautious and guarded, but it transformed her face completely. "Because I have plans, Caleb Morrison. Plans that go far beyond just surviving." "What kind of plans?" "The kind that are going to make us both very rich," she said, and there was something in her eyes that made him believe her. "But first, we need to keep your cattle alive through the winter. And for that, we're going to need more hay." "I told you, I can't afford." "I know where we can get hay," she interrupted. "And I know how to get it without spending money we don't have." "How?" "Leave that to me," she said, and that smile was back, wider now and touched with something that looked suspiciously like mischief. "I told you I had plans." As the afternoon wore on, Caleb found himself wondering what he'd gotten himself into. He'd thought he was rescuing a helpless girl from a terrible fate, but it was becoming increasingly clear that Evangeline Hartwell was far from helpless. She was smart, resourceful, and apparently had ideas about their future that she hadn't shared with him yet. The wind picked up as evening approached, bringing with it the promise of more snow. Caleb could smell it in the air, could feel the pressure change that always preceded a major storm. They'd need to bring the horses closer to the barn, make sure there was enough firewood stacked near the house, check that the chicken coop was secure. But for the first time in 3 years, he wasn't facing the prospect of a winter storm alone. And as he watched Evangeline move around his kitchen with the confidence of someone who belonged there, he began to think that maybe, just maybe, his impulsive decision at the auction house was going to turn out to be the best thing he'd ever done. The snow began to fall just as they finished their evening meal, fat flakes that drifted down like feathers and accumulated quickly on the windowsills. By the time they'd cleaned up the dishes and banked the fire for the night, the ground was already covered with a white blanket that would only grow thicker as the hours passed. "Looks like we're snowed in," Caleb observed, peering out through the frost-covered window. "Good," Evangeline said, and when he turned to look at her, he saw that her eyes were bright with anticipation. "That means we have time to plan." "Plan for what?" "For everything," she said, and her smile was wide enough to light up the entire room. "For the ranch, for our future, for all the things we're going to accomplish together." As Caleb made his way back to the barn that night, he carried with him the image of that smile and the sound of her voice saying, "Together," as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He was beginning to realize that Evangeline Hartwell wasn't just a complication he'd bought at an auction house. She was a partner he'd been waiting for without even knowing it. The barn felt less cold that night. And when he finally drifted off to sleep, his dreams were filled not with fire and loss, but with possibilities he'd never dared to imagine. The storm lasted 3 days, burying the Blackstone Valley under 2 feet of snow and turning the world into a crystalline wilderness that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Caleb had weathered countless blizzards in his years on the ranch, but never with company, and he found himself marveling at how different everything felt with Evangeline's presence filling the spaces that had been empty for so long. She was nothing if not resourceful. While the wind howled outside and the temperature plummeted to levels that made breathing painful, she transformed his sparse bachelor's quarters into something that actually resembled a home. She found fabric in an old trunk that had belonged to his wife and fashioned curtains for the windows. She rearranged his furniture to create conversation areas and reading nooks. She even discovered a cache of books he'd forgotten he owned, tucked away in a corner of the bedroom closet. "Jane Eyre," she said, holding up a leather-bound volume with obvious delight. "I haven't read this since I was 14. "Take it," Caleb said, surprised by how much pleasure he took in her excitement. "I never was much of a reader anyway." But that wasn't entirely true, and they both discovered it on the second night of the storm when she began reading aloud while he worked on repairing a broken bridle. Her voice was clear and expressive, bringing the characters to life in a way that made him forget about the howling wind and the cold that seeped through even the best chinked walls. "You're good at that," he said when she paused to rest her voice. "My mother used to read to me when I was little," she replied, a wistful note creeping into her tone. "She said stories were the one thing nobody could ever take away from you, because once you had them in your head, they belonged to you forever." It was during those long hours of enforced closeness that Caleb began to understand the true scope of Evangeline's intelligence. She absorbed information like a sponge, asking pointed questions about ranch economics, cattle breeding, and the politics of territorial expansion. More than once, she offered suggestions that made him wonder why he'd never thought of them himself. "You said Harrison Blake has the biggest spread in the valley," she said on the third morning, as they watched the storm finally begin to exhaust itself. "How did he get so big so fast?" "Blake came here about 10 years ago with enough capital to buy out 3 smaller ranchers," Caleb explained. "He's got political connections back east, investors who see cattle ranching as the next big opportunity for making money. And he's been expanding ever since, every chance he gets. He'll make an offer to struggling ranchers, usually for less than their land is worth. If they refuse, he finds ways to make their lives difficult until they change their minds." "What kind of ways?" Caleb hesitated, not wanting to frighten her, but seeing in her eyes that she'd rather know the truth than be protected from it. "Cattle go missing. Water sources get mysteriously polluted. Sometimes there are accidents that aren't really accidents." "Has he approached you?" "Not yet. My place is too small to be worth his trouble, and I've never given him any reason to see me as a threat. But that could change," she said thoughtfully, and there was something in her tone that made him look at her more closely. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that maybe it's time Harrison Blake started paying attention to us," she said, and that dangerous smile was back. "But first, we need to solve our immediate problem." She wouldn't tell him what she had in mind, no matter how much he pressed her. All she would say was that she needed to wait for the storm to clear completely and for the roads to become passable again. In the meantime, she busied herself with projects that seemed designed to transform not just his house, but his entire operation. She inventoried every piece of equipment on the ranch, making lists of what needed repair and what needed replacement. She calculated feed requirements down to the pound, factoring in variables like temperature, wind exposure, and the breeding cycle of his cattle. She even drew up plans for improving the layout of his buildings, sketching diagrams that showed how relocating the hay storage could improve efficiency and reduce waste. "Where did you learn all this?" Caleb asked, genuinely amazed by her thoroughness. "My father wasn't just a rancher," she said, not looking up from the ledger where she was recording her findings. "He was a good rancher. He taught me that success comes from paying attention to details that other people ignore." "And your stepfather? Didn't he see the value in what you knew?" Her hand stilled on the page, and when she looked up, her eyes were hard as flint. "Jeremiah Hartwell saw value in one thing only, how much money he could make by getting rid of me. He had no interest in anything I might know or contribute. It was a reminder of just how precarious her situation had been, and Caleb felt a fresh surge of anger at the man who'd been willing to sell his own stepdaughter to the highest bidder. But before he could say anything, Evangeline was back to her calculations, her mind already moving on to more practical concerns. The morning of the fourth day dawned clear and blindingly bright, with a sun that turned the snow-covered landscape into a field of diamonds. The wind had finally died completely, leaving behind the crystalline silence that only came after major storms. Caleb woke in the barn to find that the temperature had risen enough to make breathing comfortable, and he knew that the roads would be passable within a day or two. He found Evangeline in the kitchen, fully dressed and obviously preparing for something more ambitious than their usual morning routine. She'd braided her hair severely back from her face, and she wore the brown wool dress with an air of purpose that made him think of a general preparing for battle. "Today's the day," she announced without preamble. "We're going to solve our hay problem." "How exactly are we going to do that?" "We're going to pay a visit to Marcus Webb," she said, and there was something in her voice that made him think she'd been planning this conversation for days. "You said he's struggling since his wife died, that he's having trouble keeping his place running with just his son to help." "That's right, but I don't see how." "Marcus Webb has hay," she interrupted. "I'd bet my life on it. A man who's been ranching as long as he has doesn't get caught short on winter feed, no matter what other problems he might be having. Even if that's true, Webb's not the type to sell hay to a neighbor who needs it. That's not how things work out here." "Who said anything about selling?" Evangeline asked, and that dangerous smile was back in full force. "I'm talking about trading." "Trading what?" "We don't have anything he needs." "We have something he needs more than hay," she said, moving to the window and gazing out at the snow-covered landscape. "We have labor, and we have expertise." It took Caleb a moment to understand what she was suggesting, and when he did, he felt something that might have been admiration mixed with healthy respect for her audacity. "You want to offer our services in exchange for hay." "I want to offer a partnership," she corrected. "Webb's got the land and the cattle, but he doesn't have enough hands to work them properly. We've got the knowledge and the willingness to work. We pool our resources, share the labor, and everybody benefits." "And you think he'll go for that?" "I think Marcus Webb is desperate enough to listen to any reasonable proposal," she said. "And I think we're about to make him an offer he can't refuse." The ride to Webb's ranch took them through country that had been transformed by the storm into something that belonged in a fairy tale. The snow lay pristine and unmarked, except for the occasional track of a deer or coyote, and the air was so clear that distant mountains seemed close enough to touch. Under other circumstances, Caleb might have enjoyed the beauty of it, but he was too nervous about what they were attempting to appreciate the scenery. Webb's place was smaller than Caleb's but better maintained, with buildings that showed the attention of a man who took pride in his work. The house was a two-story structure with gingerbread trim and a wide porch that suggested it had been built by someone who intended to stay. Smoke rose from the chimney, and there were signs of recent activity around the barn and outbuildings. Marcus Webb himself emerged from the barn as they rode up, a tall, angular man in his 50s with graying hair, and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent working outdoors. His son followed behind him, a gangly teenager who looked like he was trying to fill boots that were still too big for him. "Caleb Morrison," Webb said, his voice carrying the cautious friendliness of rural neighbors who knew each other by reputation, if not by close acquaintance. "Wasn't expecting to see anybody out in weather like this." "Marcus," Caleb replied, dismounting and helping Evangeline down from her horse. "I'd like you to meet my wife, Evangeline." The lie came so naturally that it surprised him, but Evangeline stepped smoothly into the role, offering Webb her hand with exactly the right mixture of confidence and deference. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Webb," she said. "I've heard wonderful Things about your operation. Have you now? Webb's eyes were sharp as they took in everything about her, from her practical clothing to the way she'd handled her horse. Can't say I've heard much about you, Mrs. Morrison. When did you two get married? Recently, Evangeline said smoothly. I came out from Colorado after Caleb, and I corresponded for several months. My father had a small ranch there before he passed. It was a perfectly believable story, and Webb seemed to accept it at face value. Well, come on inside where it's warm, he said. Martha, this is my boy. Martha, say hello to Mr. and Mrs. Morrison. The boy mumbled a greeting, his face flushing red with adolescent awkwardness. He was maybe 16, all elbows and knees and obvious discomfort with the social niceties that his father was trying to teach him. Webb's house was clean, but showed the unmistakable signs of being maintained by men who were doing their best without really knowing what they were doing. The furniture was dusted, but not arranged with any eye for comfort or aesthetics. The kitchen was functional but lacked the small touches that made a house feel like a home. Coffee? Webb offered, moving toward the stove with the slightly uncertain movements of a man who was still learning to manage domestic tasks. Please, Evangeline said, and Caleb noticed how her eyes took in every detail of the room without seeming to stare. You have a lovely home. My wife did most of the decorating, Webb said, and there was a weight of sadness in his voice that made Caleb remember his own early days of widowhood. I'm afraid I'm not much good at the household side of things. It's difficult managing everything alone, Evangeline said, her voice carrying just the right note of sympathy. Caleb was telling me how hard you've been working to keep everything running since your loss. Webb's face tightened slightly, and Caleb could see him wondering where this conversation was headed. We're managing, he said carefully. I'm sure. You are, Evangeline said. But it occurred to us that we might be able to help each other out. Caleb and I have been talking about the challenges that all of us small ranchers face, especially during winters like this one. What kind of challenges? Webb asked, settling into a chair across from them with a cup of coffee in his hands. Feed. Mostly, Evangeline said, and Caleb had to admire how smoothly she'd steered the conversation exactly where she wanted it. Caleb's been worried about having enough hay to get his cattle through if the winter runs long. And I imagine you've been concerned about having enough hands to work your place properly. Webb's eyes sharpened, and Caleb could see the older man reassessing his visitors. What exactly are you proposing? A partnership, Evangeline said, leaning forward slightly. You've got hay and pasture land that could support more cattle than you can currently manage with just yourself and Matthew. We've got labor and expertise that we could contribute to a joint operation. You're talking about pooling our herds? I'm talking about pooling our resources, she corrected. Your land, our labor, shared costs, shared profits. We work your cattle and ours together, use your hay to get everyone through the winter, and split everything according to an agreed-upon formula. Webb was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup as he thought through the implications of what she was suggesting. That's a big step, he said finally. Lot of trust involved in something like that. There is, Evangeline agreed. But I think we're all trustworthy people who want the same thing, to build something sustainable that can weather the kind of challenges that defeat individual operators. And if it doesn't work out, then we dissolve the partnership and go back to what we were doing before, she said simply. But I think it will work out. I think it will work out so well that other ranchers in the valley are going to wish they'd thought of it first. Matthew Webb had been listening to the conversation with growing excitement, and now he spoke up for the first time. Pa, this sounds like exactly what we need. You've been saying yourself that we can't keep up with everything. Hush, boy, Webb said, but there was no real heat in his voice. Let me think. The silence stretched out, broken only by the ticking of a mantel clock and the occasional settling of the house around them. Caleb found himself holding his breath, waiting for Webb's decision and marveling at how completely Evangeline had taken control of the negotiation. "All right," Webb said finally. "Let's say I'm interested. What exactly would this partnership look like?" "That's what we need to work out together," Evangeline said, and Caleb could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "But I have some ideas about how we might structure it." As she began outlining her vision for their joint operation, Caleb realized that this was only the beginning. Evangeline wasn't just solving their immediate hay problem, she was laying the foundation for something much bigger. Something that could transform not just their own fortunes, but the entire way ranching was done in the Blackstone Valley. And as he watched Marcus, Webb's face light up with possibilities he'd never considered, Caleb began to understand that the girl he'd bought at an auction house was going to change everything. The handshake that sealed their partnership with Marcus Webb took place 3 days later, after hours of careful negotiation that left Caleb feeling like he'd witnessed a master class in the art of persuasion. Evangeline had thought of everything: profit-sharing formulas, work schedules, decision-making protocols, even contingency plans for disputes that might arise between the families. Webb's hay stores were indeed substantial, enough to feed their combined herds through even the harshest winter. But more importantly, his grazing land was some of the best in the valley, with natural windbreaks and access to year-round water that would allow them to expand their operation significantly come spring. "She's got a head for business, your wife," Webb told Caleb as they loaded hay onto his wagon. "Haven't seen planning like that since my Sarah was alive." Caleb nodded, watching Evangeline as she worked alongside Matthew Webb to organize the feed schedule for their newly combined herds. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd done this kind of work before, and he found himself wondering again about her father's ranch in Colorado and what other skills she might be hiding. The partnership changed everything about their daily routine. Instead of the solitary work that had characterized Caleb's ranching for the past 3 years, he now found himself part of a team that included not just Evangeline and the Webbs, but also 2 Mexican cowboys whom Webb had hired the previous spring, experienced hands named Diego Morales and his younger brother Carlos. "Senora Morrison," Diego said to Evangeline on their second day of joint operations, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. "Your husband, he's a lucky man to have a wife who understands cattle so well." "Thank you, Diego," she replied in fluent Spanish that surprised everyone within earshot. "I learned from my father that cattle don't care if you're a man or woman. They only care if you know what you're doing." Diego's weathered face broke into a grin. "Sí, exactamente. Is good to work for people who understand this." The language skills were just one more revelation in what was becoming a long series of surprises about Evangeline's background. She could read Spanish as well as speak it, which proved invaluable when they discovered that Webb's property deeds included water rights that had been documented only in the original Spanish land grants. "This changes everything," she said, spreading the yellowed documents across Webb's kitchen table like a general planning a campaign. "These water rights extend far beyond what any of us realized. We're not just partners in a small ranching operation, we're partners in what could become one of the most valuable properties in the territory." "What do you mean?" Webb asked, leaning over her shoulder to peer at the incomprehensible legal language. "I mean that according to these documents, we have legal claim to water from the entire Blackstone Creek watershed," she said, her finger tracing the boundaries described in the grant. "That includes the streams that run through Harrison Blake's property." The implications hit them all at the same time. Water was everything in cattle country, and the man who controlled the water controlled the land. If Evangeline was right about the extent of Webb's water rights, they weren't just small ranchers trying to survive. They were potentially major players in a game that could reshape the entire valley. "Are you sure about this?" Caleb asked, though. He could see from her expression that she was certain. "I'm sure," she said. "But proving it in court would be expensive and time-consuming." We'd need lawyers, surveyors, maybe even experts in Spanish colonial law. That kind of legal fight could take years, Webb said, his excitement tempered by practical concerns. And it would cost more money than any of us have. Not necessarily, Evangeline said, and that dangerous smile was back. There are other ways to establish a claim to water rights. Ways that don't require courts or lawyers. Before anyone could ask what she meant, they were interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching at speed. Through the window, Caleb could see a rider pushing his horse hard across the snow-covered pasture, and something about the urgency of his approach made everyone in the room tensed out. The rider turned out to be young Billy Hutchison, who worked for the territorial marshal in Copper Ridge. He was barely 18, all freckles and nervous energy, and he pulled his lathered horse to a stop in front of Webb's porch with the dramatic flair of someone who took his official duties very seriously. "Mr. Webb, Mr. Morrison," he called out, sliding down from his saddle. "Marshall wants to see you both in town right away. There's been trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Caleb asked, stepping out onto the porch. "Cattle theft," Billy said, his young face grave with the importance of his news. "Someone hit the Blake Ranch last night. Took maybe 50 head of prime breeding stock. Mr. Blake is madder than a wet cat, and he's demanding justice." Caleb felt his stomach drop. Cattle rustling was a hanging offense in the territory, and accusations alone could be enough to destroy a man's reputation. "What does this have to do with us?" "Blake's saying it was an inside job," Billy continued. "Someone who knew his operation, knew where his best cattle were kept. He's pointing fingers at anyone who might have had a grudge against him." "And we're on that list?" Webb asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "You are now," Billy said. "Especially since word got out about your new partnership. Blake's saying it's suspicious that you two would team up right before his cattle went missing." Evangeline had joined them on the porch, and Caleb could see her mind working as she processed this new information. "When exactly did the theft happen?" she asked. "Sometime between midnight and dawn," Billy replied. "Blake's foreman discovered the missing cattle when he did his morning count." "And where does Blake think we might have hidden 50 head of stolen cattle?" she pressed. "Has he considered the logistics of moving that many animals without being seen?" Billy looked uncomfortable. "I'm just delivering the message, ma'am. Marshal Garrett wants to talk to everyone who might have information." The ride into Copper Ridge was tense, with all of them aware that this could be more than just a routine inquiry. Harrison Blake was a powerful man with political connections, and if he'd decided they were responsible for his missing cattle, he had the influence to make their lives very difficult indeed. Marshal Garrett was waiting for them in his office, a compact man in his 40s with graying hair and the kind of steady demeanor that came from years of dealing with frontier justice. He'd been fair in his dealings with Caleb in the past, but fairness only went so far when you were dealing with men like Blake. "Caleb Marcus," Garrett said, nodding to each of them in turn. "And this must be Mrs. Morrison. I've been hearing interesting things about your new partnership." "All legal and above board," Webb said quickly. "We filed the proper papers with the territorial office." "I'm sure you did," Garrett replied. "The question is whether your partnership might have given you access to information about Blake's operation that you didn't have before." "What kind of information?" Evangeline asked, and Caleb noticed that she'd adopted the same carefully neutral tone that she'd used during their negotiations with Webb. "The kind that would tell you exactly where Blake keeps his prize breeding bulls," Garrett said. "The kind that would let you know when his night riders would be changing shifts. The kind that would make a theft like this look easy." "Marshal," Caleb said, keeping his voice level, "we've been working our own cattle for the past week. We haven't had time to plan elaborate thefts, and we certainly haven't had any contact with Blake's operation. Can you prove that?" "Can Blake prove we were involved?" Evangeline countered. "Because accusations without evidence aren't worth much, even in territorial court." Garrett's eyes sharpened as he looked at her. "You seem to know something about territorial law, Mrs. Morrison." "I know something about justice," she replied. "And I know that innocent people shouldn't be harassed just because someone powerful wants a scapegoat." Before Garrett could respond, the door to his office burst open and Harrison Blake himself strode in, bringing with him the kind of presence that filled a room and demanded attention. He was a big man, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver hair and the kind of expensive clothes that marked him as someone with serious money. "Garrett," he said without preamble, "I hope you're not wasting time with pleasantries. These people stole my cattle, and I want them arrested." "Now hold on, Blake," Garrett said, rising from his chair. "I'm conducting an investigation, not a lynching." "Investigation?" Blake's voice was loud enough to rattle the windows. "What's to investigate?" "Morrison here has been struggling to keep his place afloat. Webb's been having trouble since his wife died. Now suddenly they're partners, and my cattle disappear the same week. That's not coincidence, that's planning." "Mr. Blake," Evangeline said, her voice cutting through his bluster like a knife through butter, "you seem very certain about our involvement. Almost as if you know something about this theft that the rest of us don't." Blake's face darkened as he turned his attention to her. "And who might you be?" "Evangeline Morrison," she said, rising from her chair with the kind of grace that made her seem taller than she actually was. "Caleb's wife. And I'm curious about something." "What's that?" "How exactly does a man lose 50 head of prime breeding stock without anyone seeing or hearing anything? Those animals would have been vocal, especially if they were being moved. At night, they would have left tracks that even a blind man could follow. So either your security is incompetent or ... "Or what?" Blake demanded. "Or someone wanted those cattle to disappear," she said simply. "Someone who knew exactly how to move them without raising an alarm. Someone who had access to your property and your operation." The silence that followed was deafening. Blake's face had gone red, and Caleb could see veins standing out on his forehead. But there was something else in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty that suggested Evangeline had hit closer to the truth than he was comfortable with. "Are you accusing me of stealing my own cattle?" Blake asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "I'm not accusing anyone of anything," Evangeline replied. "I'm simply pointing out that your accusations against us don't make sense from a practical standpoint. But if you're determined to pursue this matter, perhaps we should discuss it in a more formal setting." "What kind of formal setting?" "Territorial court," she said. "Where accusations have to be backed up with evidence, and where false accusations carry penalties of their own." Blake stared at her for a long moment, and Caleb could practically see the calculations running through his mind. A court case would require him to open his books, to allow examination of his operation, to answer questions about his business, practices under oath. For a man with Blake's political ambitions, that kind of scrutiny could be dangerous. "This isn't over," he said finally, but the fight had gone out of his voice. "If I find proof that any of you were involved in this theft, I'll see you all hang." After Blake stormed out, Marshal Garrett sat back down with a heavy sigh. "That was interesting," he said to Evangeline. "You've got Blake thinking, and that's more than most people manage." "Thinking about what?" Webb asked. "About whether pressing this matter is worth the risk of having his own operation examined too closely," Garrett replied. "Blake's got a lot of secrets, and some of them might not look good in the light of day." As they rode back to the ranch, Caleb found himself looking at Evangeline with new eyes. She'd just faced down one of the most powerful men in the territory without flinching, had turned his own accusations back on him with a skill that suggested experience in much more serious conflicts than ranch disputes. "Where did you learn to handle men like Blake?" he asked. "From watching my stepfather," she said, her voice carrying a bitter edge. Jeremiah Hartwell was cut from the same cloth, all bluster and intimidation, until someone stood up to him. Men like that are bullies at heart, and bullies always back down when they meet someone who isn't afraid of them. "And you're not afraid of him?" "I'm not afraid of any man," she said, and there was something in her voice that made him believe her. "I've survived worse than Harrison Blake, and I'll survive whatever he tries to throw at us." But as they rode through the gathering dusk toward home, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Blake wasn't the type to forget a humiliation, and a man with his resources could cause them trouble in ways they hadn't even imagined yet. What worried him even more was the growing certainty that Evangeline was planning something that would put them all in even greater danger. She'd hinted at ways to establish water rights that didn't involve courts or lawyers, had spoken of making other ranchers wish they'd thought of their partnership first. Whatever she was planning, Caleb had the feeling it was going to change everything. In the Blackstone Valley, the only question was whether they'd all survive the transformation she had in mind. Spring arrived in the Blackstone Valley like a gunshot, sudden and explosive after the long winter siege. The snow melted in torrents that turned every creek into a raging river and every depression into a temporary lake. And with the thaw came visitors, lots of them, all drawn by stories of the partnership that had somehow acquired 30,000 acres of prime grazing land and humiliated Harrison Blake in the process. Evangeline had been expecting them. In fact, as Caleb discovered, she'd been counting on them. Her kitchen table had become a nerve center of operations, covered with maps, ledgers, correspondence, and architectural plans that she'd somehow commissioned from Denver. She met with arriving ranchers the way a general might meet with potential. All eyes, assessing their strengths, their needs, and their willingness to commit to something larger than their individual operations. "The Johansson brothers from up north," she announced one morning as Caleb came in from checking the cattle. "They're bringing 2,000 heads and 40,000 acres of mountain pasture. The catch is they need access to railroad shipping, which they've never been able to afford on their own." "And the Kowalskis?" "Ready to join, but they want assurance that we can provide veterinary services. They can't afford to lose another herd to disease." She made a note in her ever-present journal. "I've already sent word to a veterinarian in Denver who specializes in range cattle. Dr. Elizabeth Hartley, yes. Another woman who's had to fight for every opportunity she's gotten." The scope of what Evangeline was building began to crystallize as more ranchers signed partnership agreements. It wasn't just a cattle operation, it was a comprehensive agricultural cooperative that would control every aspect of livestock production, from breeding to final sale. Shared resources, shared expertise, shared profits, and most importantly, shared power in negotiations with railroad companies, meat packers, and territorial politicians. "You're creating something that's never existed before," said Thomas Brennan, the elderly rancher who'd been one of the first to settle in the valley. "A ranchers' union, essentially." "I'm creating what should have existed all along," Evangeline corrected. "Individual ranchers competing against each other while corporations pick us off one by one. That's not business, that's suicide." But success brought new challenges, and the biggest challenge arrived on a Tuesday morning in the form of 3 men in expensive suits who rode up to their door in a carriage that looked like it belonged in Boston rather than the Montana Territory. "Mrs. Morrison," said the lead man, a thin, pale individual with the kind of soft hands that had never held anything heavier than a pen. "My name is Reginald Thornfield, and I represent certain business interests back east who've taken notice of your recent acquisitions." Evangeline invited them in with the same gracious hospitality she showed to everyone, but Caleb could see the wariness in her eyes. These weren't ranchers looking for partnership. These were predators looking for prey. "We understand you've assembled quite an impressive portfolio of land and water rights," Thornfield continued, accepting the coffee Evangeline offered without any apparent gratitude. Our clients are prepared to make you a very generous offer for the entire operation. How generous? Evangeline asked, though her tone suggested she was asking more out of curiosity than actual interest. $2 million, Thornfield said, as if you were discussing the weather. Cash payment, immediate transfer, no complications. The silence that followed was deafening. $2 million was more money than existed in most territorial banks, more money than Caleb had imagined could exist in one place. It was enough to buy a small city, enough to live like royalty for multiple lifetimes. That's a very generous offer, Evangeline said finally. May I ask who your clients are? I'm afraid I'm not at liberty to disclose that information, Thornfield replied, but I can assure you they're serious people with serious resources. This offer represents fair market value for your holdings. Fair market value, Evangeline repeated, and Caleb could hear something dangerous creeping into her voice. According to whom? According to our appraisers who've conducted a thorough evaluation of your assets. Your appraisers who've been trespassing on our land without permission? She asked, and Thornfield's confident expression flickered slightly. Yes, Mr. Thornfield, we've been aware of your people surveying our property for the past month. We've also been aware of your inquiries at the Territorial Land Office and your attempts to find irregularities in our title claims. I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Thornfield said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. I'm sure you do, Evangeline replied. Just as I'm sure your clients aren't Eastern businessmen looking for investment opportunities. They're railroad companies, aren't they? Companies that need to run track through our land to connect the northern territories to the transcontinental system. Thornfield's face had gone pale, and Caleb realized that Evangeline had just demonstrated knowledge of business matters that went far beyond anything a rancher's wife should know. The proposed Northern Pacific route, she continued, pulling out a map that Caleb had never seen before. It runs directly through our water rights, across land that we now control through partnership agreements. Without access to our property, the railroad will have to build a route that's 3 times as expensive and twice as long. Mrs. Morrison, Thornfield said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration, you're clearly an intelligent woman. Surely you understand that fighting the railroad is a battle you can't win. I'm not fighting the railroad, she said, folding the map carefully. I'm negotiating with it. There's a difference. What kind of negotiation? The kind where we get a fair share of the profits instead of being pushed aside like inconvenient obstacles, she said. Your clients want access to our land? They can have it. But they're going to pay for it properly. And they're going to guarantee shipping rates for our cattle that reflect our status as partners rather than customers. That's not how railroad companies do business. Then maybe it's time they learned, she said, and that dangerous smile was back. Because they have 2 choices: negotiate with us as equals, or find another route for their railroad. After Thornfield and his colleagues left empty-handed and considerably less confident than they'd arrived, Caleb found himself staring at Evangeline as if he'd never seen her before. How did you know about the railroad? He asked. I've been researching territorial development plans for months, she said, spreading out additional maps that revealed the full scope of her knowledge. Railroad expansion, mining claims, territorial, statehood proposals, all of it connected, all of it pointing toward massive changes in how the West gets developed. And you've been planning for this the whole time? I've been planning to make sure we're the ones doing the developing instead of being developed out of existence, she said. The railroad is just the beginning. There's talk of a major silver strike in the mountains to our east, which means mining companies will need cattle to feed their workers. There's pressure from Washington to grant statehood, which means territorial land grants will become state property with different legal protections. She pointed to various locations on her maps, and Caleb could see that she'd been thinking several moves ahead in a game that most people didn't even know they were playing. Every change brings opportunity, she continued. But only if you're positioned to take advantage of it. What we've built here isn't just a ranching cooperative. It's a foundation for controlling the economic development of this entire region. Before Caleb could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of Marcus Webb, whose usual calm demeanor had been replaced by obvious excitement. "Evangeline, you need to see this," he said, holding up a telegram. "It's from the territorial governor's office." She read the telegram quickly, her eyes widening as she took in its contents. "They want to meet with us," she said, looking up at Caleb with an expression of barely contained triumph. "The governor wants to discuss our innovative approach to agricultural development and its potential impact on territorial policy." "What does that mean?" Caleb asked. "It means we've gotten their attention," Webb said. "The territorial government is starting to see us as a legitimate political force. More than that," Evangeline added. "It means they're starting to see us as necessary. Railroad development, mining operations, eventual statehood, all of it depends on having a stable, profitable agricultural base. And right now, we represent the best hope for creating that base." The next week brought a parade of visitors that transformed their quiet ranch into something resembling a territorial capital. Politicians, businessmen, journalists, and fellow ranchers all came to see what they'd built and to understand how it might affect their own interests. But the most important visitor arrived on a Thursday afternoon, traveling alone and unannounced. Dr. Elizabeth Hartley turned out to be a woman in her 30s with prematurely gray hair and the kind of intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She'd ridden from Denver by herself, carrying medical supplies and veterinary instruments in saddlebags that had clearly seen hard use. "Mrs. Morrison," she said, dismounting from her horse with the easy grace of someone who'd spent considerable time in the saddle. "I received your letter about providing veterinary services for your cooperative. I have to say, it's the most interesting professional opportunity I've encountered in years." Over dinner, Dr. Hartley revealed herself to be not just a skilled veterinarian, but a woman with her own revolutionary ideas about agricultural development. She'd studied scientific breeding techniques in Europe, had developed new treatments for range diseases, and had been fighting for years to establish veterinary medicine as a legitimate profession for women. "What you've created here," she said, gesturing toward the maps and documents that covered Evangeline's table, "it's exactly what the West needs. Rational, scientific, cooperative development instead of the usual chaos of individual competition." "It's not just about efficiency," Evangeline replied. "It's about power. For too long, Western development has been controlled by Eastern capital and Eastern interests. What we're building gives Western people control over their own economic destiny. And you think the territorial government will support that?" "I think the territorial government will support whatever makes them look good to Washington," Evangeline said. "And right now, what makes them look good is demonstrating that they can manage development in a way that benefits local interests rather than just outside investors." As the evening progressed, Caleb found himself watching the two women with growing amazement. They were planning not just a business venture, but a complete transformation of how the American West would be developed. Their vision extended far beyond cattle ranching to include scientific agriculture, industrial development, transportation networks, and even educational institutions. "You're talking about building a civilization," he said when they paused for breath. "We're talking about building the right kind of civilization," Dr. Hartley corrected. "One that's based on cooperation and scientific progress rather than exploitation and waste. One that gives women the same opportunities as men," Evangeline added. "Because if this venture succeeds, it's going to demonstrate that women can be just as effective as men at managing large-scale economic development." Late that night, after Dr. Hartley had retired to the guest room they'd prepared for her, Caleb and Evangeline sat by the fire discussing everything that had happened. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "All of this. The complexity, the pressure, the risks. "Do you regret buying me at that auction house?" she countered. "Never," he said, and was surprised by the vehemence in his own voice. "Then I don't regret anything either," she said. "Because if you hadn't done that, none of this would have been possible. I'd probably be dead by now, or worse. And I'd still be a broken-down widower slowly drinking himself to death," Caleb admitted. "You saved me as much as I saved you. We saved each other," she corrected. "And now we're going to save this entire valley from being carved up by railroad companies and mining corporations." As spring turned toward summer, their operation continued to expand. More ranchers joined the cooperative, bringing their land, cattle, and expertise into the growing network that Evangeline had created. The railroad negotiations intensified, with offers and counteroffers flowing back and forth between their kitchen table and boardrooms in Chicago and New York. But success brought new enemies, and Caleb was beginning to understand that Harrison Blake was the least of their problems. There were forces at work, political, economic, and social, that saw their cooperation as a threat to the established order of Western development. And as he watched Evangeline working late into the night, planning strategies and calculating risks with the intensity of a chess master, he realized that the real battle was just beginning. The assassination attempt came on a Tuesday morning in late June, just as Evangeline was reviewing shipping contracts for their first major cattle drive to the new railroad depot in Helena. Caleb was in the barn when he heard the crack of rifle fire, followed immediately by the sound of splintering wood and Evangeline's sharp cry of alarm. He ran toward the house with his heart pounding, drawing his pistol as he moved. Through the kitchen window, he could see Evangeline crouched behind the overturned table, blood running down her left arm where a rifle bullet had grazed her shoulder. The carefully organized papers that represented months of planning were scattered across the floor, some of them stained with her blood. "Stay down," he shouted, though she was already moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been in similar situations before. She'd grabbed a shotgun from the rack beside the door and was checking the loads with steady hands despite her injury. "2 shooters," she called back, her voice tight with pain but completely focused. "One in the cottonwoods by the creek, one behind the barn. They're not trying to kill us, they're trying to scare us." "How can you tell?" "Because if they wanted us dead, we'd be dead already," she replied, wincing as she moved her wounded arm. "Those were warning shots. Someone wants us to know we're vulnerable." The attack lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours. The hidden riflemen fired a few more shots that deliberately missed their targets, shattering windows and splintering door frames without actually endangering anyone. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the shooting stopped, leaving behind only the acrid smell of gunpowder and the sound of their cattle lowing nervously in the distance. Caleb waited a full 10 minutes before emerging from cover, his gun drawn and ready. The shooters were long gone, but they'd left behind clear evidence of their message bullet holes that spelled out "Leave" in the wooden wall of the barn. "Professional work," Evangeline observed as Caleb helped her bandage her wounded arm. "Someone with military training, or at least extensive experience with firearms. Blake? Blake doesn't have the subtlety for something like this," she said, studying the pattern of bullet holes with the analytical detachment of a chess master examining a particularly clever move. This required planning, patience, and the kind of expertise that costs serious money. Dr. Hartley arrived within an hour of the attack, summoned by a message that Caleb had sent via their fastest rider. She examined Evangeline's wound with professional efficiency, cleaning and stitching the graze while listening to their account of what had happened. "You're lucky," she said, securing the bandage with practiced hands. "A few inches to the right, and that bullet would have hit an artery, but I don't think luck had anything to do with it." "What do you mean?" "I mean whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing," Dr. Hartley replied. "They wanted to wound you, not kill you. They wanted to send a message without creating a martyr. The message became clearer over the next few days as reports filtered in from other members of their cooperative. Similar attacks had occurred across the valley, mysterious fires that destroyed hay stores without spreading to other buildings. Cattle that disappeared overnight only to be found unharmed several miles away. Equipment that was sabotaged in ways that caused expensive delays without actually preventing work from continuing. Someone's running a systematic campaign of intimidation, Marcus Webb reported during an emergency meeting at their ranch. Every family in the cooperative has been hit, but nobody's been seriously hurt. It's like they're testing our resolve. Or trying to make us abandon the railroad negotiations, Evangeline suggested, her wounded arm in a sling but her mind clearly unaffected by the injury. Someone who stands to lose a lot of money if we succeed in getting fair shipping rates. The railroad companies themselves? More likely their competitors, she said, spreading out a map that showed the proposed rail routes through their territory. If the Northern Pacific has to negotiate with us as equals, it sets a precedent for every other railroad. Expansion in the West, that's worth millions of dollars to the companies that have been counting on cheap access to Western resources. The attacks escalated over the following weeks, becoming bolder and more direct. Riders wearing masks appeared at isolated ranches, delivering verbal threats to families who joined the cooperative. Supply shipments were delayed or misdirected. Letters containing detailed surveillance reports on cooperative members. Daily activities were delivered to their homes, but instead of weakening their resolve, the intimidation campaign seemed to strengthen the bonds between cooperative members. Ranchers who'd been hesitant about the scope of Evangeline's plans now threw themselves fully into the venture, understanding that they were facing an enemy with resources far beyond anything Harrison Blake could muster. "They've made a mistake," Evangeline observed during another strategy meeting. "They've shown us that what we're building is important enough for powerful people to be afraid of it. That means we're on the right track. It also means we need to be prepared for escalation," Dr. Hartley added. She'd moved permanently to the valley, establishing a medical practice that served the entire cooperative, while also coordinating what was essentially an intelligence network. "These aren't random acts of violence. They're probing attacks designed to test our defenses and identify our weaknesses." The next escalation came in the form of legal challenges. Lawyers representing unnamed clients began filing court papers, questioning the validity of their land grants, challenging their water rights, and demanding investigations into their business practices. Each legal action required expensive responses and time-consuming court appearances that disrupted their operations. "They're trying to bury us in litigation," Evangeline said, reviewing the latest stack of legal documents. "Even if we win every case, the costs could bankrupt us before we ever get to trial." "Can we countersue?" "We can, but that just adds to our legal expenses," she replied. "No, we need a different approach. We need to go on the offensive." The offensive strategy she developed was characteristically audacious. Instead of simply defending against legal challenges, they would launch their own investigation into the companies that were attacking them. Dr. Hartley's medical practice gave her access to territorial records, while Evangeline's correspondence with Eastern business contacts provided intelligence about corporate activities that weren't part of the public record. "Look at this," Evangeline said, spreading documents across the kitchen table that had become their war room. "The lawyers filing suits against us are all connected to a single law firm in Chicago. That firm represents railroad interests, mining companies, and Eastern investment groups that are all trying to acquire Western land at below-market prices. So it's a coordinated campaign?" "It's more than that," she said, pointing to names and dates on the documents. "It's a systematic effort to prevent Western agricultural interests from organizing effectively. We're not the first cooperative they've targeted. They've broken up similar groups in Kansas, Nebraska, and Colorado." "How?" by convincing territorial governments that agricultural cooperatives are somehow anti-American or socialist. Dr. Hartley explained. She'd been researching similar cases and had uncovered a pattern of corporate manipulation that extended across multiple territories. They use intimidation to weaken the cooperatives, then legal challenges to drain their resources, and finally political pressure to convince local officials that the cooperatives are threats to economic development. And it's worked? Until now, Evangeline said, and that dangerous smile was back. But they've never faced an opponent who understood their tactics and was prepared to use them. The counteroffensive began with seemingly innocent social activities. Evangeline organized a series of territorial meetings that were ostensibly focused on agricultural education, but actually served to build political connections between cooperative members and territorial officials. Dr. Hartley used her medical practice to gather information about the families and business interests of the lawyers who were challenging them. But the real breakthrough came when they discovered that one of their attackers had made a critical mistake. During a raid on the Henderson Ranch, one of the masked riders had been thrown from his horse and left behind a distinctive silver spur that belonged to a specific cavalry unit. The 7th Cavalry, Caleb said, examining the spur with growing recognition. I served with men who wore spurs like this during the war. More importantly, Evangeline added, the 7th Cavalry has been stationed at Fort McKinney for the past 2 years. That's less than 50 miles from here. You think military personnel are involved in the attacks? I think someone with connections to the military is using discharged soldiers as hired muscle, she said. And that gives us leverage we didn't have before. The leverage came in the form of Evangeline's growing political connections. The territorial governor who'd invited them to discuss agricultural policy was facing pressure from Washington to demonstrate effective management of Western development. Discovery that military resources were being used to intimidate civilian agricultural cooperatives would be a scandal that could end his political career. Governor Morrison, no relation, despite the name has ambitions for statehood, Evangeline explained as she prepared for their most important political meeting yet. He needs to show Washington that he can manage territorial affairs without federal intervention. If we can prove that someone's been using military resources for private corporate interests, he'll have to take action. The meeting with Governor Morrison took place in the territorial capital, a growing town that aspired to become a real city but still looked more like an overgrown frontier settlement. The governor himself was a distinguished man in his 50s with political instincts, sharp enough to recognize that Evangeline represented both an opportunity and a potential threat. Mrs. Morrison, he said, greeting her with the kind of careful courtesy that politicians reserve for people whose influence they couldn't quite measure. I've been hearing remarkable things about your agricultural cooperative. Some people are calling it the future of Western development. And what do you call it, Governor? I call it interesting, he replied, gesturing for her to take a seat in his private office. The question is whether it's interesting in a way that helps or hurts territorial development. That depends on whether you're more interested in helping Eastern corporations extract wealth from the territory, or in building sustainable economic development that benefits territorial residents, she said. And Caleb could see the governor reassessing her based on the directness of her response. Those aren't necessarily mutually exclusive goals, the governor said carefully. They are when Eastern corporations are using military resources to intimidate territorial citizens, Evangeline replied, placing the cavalry spur on his desk like a chess piece claiming checkmate. The silence that followed was profound. Governor Morrison stared at the spur for a long moment, his political instincts clearly working through the implications of what she was suggesting. That's a serious accusation, he said finally. It's a serious situation, she replied. Someone has been using discharged military personnel to conduct organized attacks against members of our cooperative. Attacks that include attempted assassination, property destruction, and systematic intimidation. If federal authorities discover that territorial officials were aware of this and failed to take action. She let the sentence hang unfinished, but the threat was clear. A territorial governor who allowed military resources to be used for private, corporate interests would face federal investigation, congressional hearings, and the end of any hope for statehood. "What exactly are you proposing?" Governor Morrison asked. "Protection for cooperative members, investigation of the attacks, and prosecution of whoever's responsible," she said. "In exchange, we'll make sure that our railroad negotiations result in terms that benefit the territory as well as our cooperative. And if I refuse, then we'll take our evidence directly to Washington and let federal authorities handle the investigation," she said simply. "But I think you'd prefer to handle this yourself." The governor studied her face for a long moment, clearly trying to determine whether she was bluffing. Whatever he saw there convinced him that she wasn't. "Very well," he said finally. "You'll have territorial protection for your cooperative members, and I'll launch an official investigation into these attacks. But I'll expect your cooperation. In return, including detailed information about your railroad negotiations and your expansion plans." "Of course," Evangeline agreed. "We've always believed in transparency when dealing with legitimate government authority." As they rode back toward the valley, Caleb found himself shaking his head in amazement. "You just backed down the territorial governor." "I just gave the territorial governor an opportunity to do the right thing while protecting his own political interests," she corrected. "That's not backing him down, that's offering him partnership. And if he tries to double-cross us, then we'll handle that when it happens," she said, her green eyes bright with the satisfaction of a successful negotiation. "But I don't think he will. Governor Morrison is ambitious, but he's not stupid. He understands that what we're building could be the foundation for successful statehood." The protection they'd negotiated proved effective. Within days of their meeting with the governor, territorial marshals were patrolling cooperative ranches, and the mysterious attacks ceased as suddenly as they'd begun. The legal challenges continued, but they now faced coordinated defense funded by territorial resources. But Caleb knew that this was only a temporary victory. The forces they were fighting had resources and connections that extended far beyond the Montana Territory, and they wouldn't give up easily. Somewhere in corporate boardrooms in Chicago and New York, men were planning new strategies for breaking up the cooperative and preventing the kind of organized Western development that Evangeline was pioneering. The real war was just beginning, and the stakes were nothing less than the future of the American West. 5 years after that desperate night at the auction house in Copper Ridge, Caleb Morrison stood on the covered porch of the finest house in what was now being called Morrison City, watching the sunrise paint the Blackstone Valley in shades of gold and crimson. The valley had been transformed beyond recognition, dotted with prosperous ranches, a thriving railroad depot, 2 grain elevators, and a main street lined with businesses that served a population approaching 3,000 souls. But it wasn't the physical transformation that amazed him most. It was the woman who'd made it all possible, currently visible through the window of what had once been their kitchen, and was now the nerve center of the largest agricultural cooperative in the American West. Evangeline Morrison, for they had indeed married in a proper ceremony 18 months after their first meeting, surrounded by half the territory and presided over by a federal judge, was conducting her morning briefing with the efficiency of a battlefield commander. Around the polished mahogany table sat representatives from 47 ranches, 2 mining operations, 3 lumber mills, and the Territorial Railroad Commission. "The Chicago markets are strong," reported Samuel Jang, their shipping coordinator, who'd arrived from California with revolutionary ideas about international trade. "Beef prices are up 12% from last year, and our reputation for quality has us booked solid through next spring." "Excellent," Evangeline replied, making notes in the leather journal that had grown from a personal record into the most important business document in the territory. What about the mining contracts? The silver strike in the eastern hills is producing better than projected, said Dr. Hartley, who'd evolved from veterinarian to territorial health commissioner to unofficial minister of economic development. The mining companies need 600 head per month to feed their workforce, and they're willing to pay premium prices for guaranteed delivery. Caleb smiled as he listened to the proceedings. The assassination attempt 5 years ago had been the last serious attempt to break up their cooperation through violence. The corporate interests that had initially opposed them had eventually been forced to accept that organized Western development was more profitable than the old system of exploitation and waste. The railroad negotiations that had once seemed impossible had resulted in the most favorable shipping agreements in territorial history. The cooperative controlled transportation rates, guaranteed shipping schedules, and received profit-sharing percentages that made every ranch family genuine partners in the territory's economic development. The Statehood Committee wants our input on the proposed constitution, announced Martha Webb, who'd taken over many administrative duties after her husband Marcus had been elected to the territorial legislature. Specifically, they want our recommendations for property rights, water law, and corporate regulation. Schedule a meeting for next week, Evangeline said. We'll need to coordinate with the other territorial cooperatives to make sure we present a unified position. Other territorial cooperatives. That was perhaps the most remarkable development of all. The model they'd pioneered in the Blackstone Valley had been copied throughout the West, creating a network of agricultural cooperatives that now controlled vast territories from Canada to Mexico. What had begun as a desperate attempt to survive one harsh winter had evolved into a complete reimagining of how Western development could work. Any word from Washington about the federal land grants? Asked Thomas Henderson, whose family had not only survived their financial crisis, but had become one of the most prosperous ranching operations in 3 territories. Senator Hartwell's bill should come up for a vote next month, Evangeline replied, and Caleb could hear the satisfaction in her voice at the irony of the name. If it passes, cooperative land grants will receive the same federal protections as railroad grants. After the meeting dispersed, Caleb joined Evangeline in their private office, a room lined with maps, photographs, and awards that documented the transformation of the valley. On the wall hung a framed copy of the Territorial Development Award they'd received from Congress, recognizing their innovative contribution to sustainable Western economic growth. Regrets? He asked, settling into the chair beside her desk. Only one, she said, looking up from the correspondence that connected them to cooperative leaders across the continent. I wish my mother could have seen this. She would have been proud. She would have been amazed, Evangeline corrected. A girl sold at auction becoming the most influential woman in territorial politics. Even she wouldn't have imagined that. Through the window, they could see the bustling activity of Morrison City's Main Street, the bank that held deposits from every cooperative family, the school that Dr. Hartley had designed to include scientific agricultural education alongside traditional subjects, the church where families of every denomination worshiped together on Sundays, the newspaper office where their weekly publication was printed and distributed to cooperative settlements throughout the West. Harrison Blake came by yesterday, Caleb mentioned, and he saw Evangeline's eyebrows rise in surprise. What did he want? To congratulate us on the congressional award, Caleb said, and to ask if there might be a place for his operation in the cooperative. Evangeline leaned back in her chair, considering this news. Blake had spent years fighting their expansion, using every legal and political maneuver he could devise to prevent their success. But the cooperative had grown too large and too successful to be stopped by individual opposition. What did you tell him? I told him that membership decisions were made by the executive committee, not by me, Caleb replied. But I also told him that the cooperative had always been open to ranchers who were willing to work for the common good instead of just their own profit. And his response? He said he was beginning to understand that cooperation was more profitable than competition, Caleb said. Amazing what 5 years of watching everyone else prosper can do to a man's philosophy. That evening they hosted their usual Sunday dinner for the extended family that the cooperative had become. The dining room of their house expanded twice to accommodate the growing number of people who considered it home, was filled with conversation in 3 languages and the laughter of children who'd grown up in a world where cooperation was normal and prosperity was shared. Matthew Webb, now 21 and engaged to Dr. Hartley's niece, was describing his plans for a veterinary college that would train professionals to serve agricultural cooperatives throughout the West. Diego Morales and his wife were discussing the success of their horse breeding program, which was supplying mounts to cavalry units and ranch operations across multiple territories. To think it all started with a scared girl on an auction block, said Marcus Webb, raising his glass in a toast. And a scarred cowboy who couldn't walk away from injustice. It started with people who understood that individual strength comes from collective action, Evangeline corrected, though she smiled at the sentiment. What we built here wasn't the result of heroic gestures. It was the result of practical people making practical decisions about how to survive and prosper together. Later, as they sat on their porch watching the stars emerge over the valley, they'd transformed. Caleb found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this point. The desperate winter that had almost broken them. The partnerships that had saved them. The enemies who'd tried to destroy them. The political battles that had legitimized them. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been at that auction house? He asked. Every day, Evangeline admitted. But not because I think my life would have been better. I wonder because I think about all the other women who didn't have someone willing to pay $200 for their freedom. What do you mean? I mean this is just the beginning, she said, her green eyes reflecting the starlight. What we've built here proves that Western development doesn't have to be based on exploitation and waste. But it's still just one valley, one cooperative, one example. You want to expand further? I want every girl who finds herself sold at auction to have the kind of opportunities I've had, she said. I want every family farm to have the same protections as corporate interests. I want the American West to be developed by the people who live here, not by Eastern corporations that see it as nothing but a source of raw materials. That's a big ambition. It's the right ambition, she said simply. And we've proven it's possible. As they prepared for bed that night, Caleb reflected on the transformation that had occurred not just in the valley, but in himself. The broken widower who'd barely been surviving on his failing ranch had become a respected leader in territorial politics, a successful businessman, and most importantly, a partner to a woman who'd changed the course of Western history. Thank you, he said as they settled into the bed they'd shared as true partners for the past 3 years. For what? For saving me, he said. For saving all of us. We saved each other, she corrected, just as she had during that first winter when they were still learning to trust each other. And tomorrow we'll keep saving people. That's what partners do. Outside their window, the lights of Morrison City twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing a family that had found prosperity and security through cooperative action. And beyond the city, the lights of other cooperative settlements dotted the landscape, connected by railroad lines and communication networks that carried their message of practical cooperation throughout the expanding territories. The girl who'd been sold at auction for $200 had become the architect of a new kind of American dream, one based not on individual competition, but on collective strength. And the scarred cowboy who'd bought her freedom had discovered that sometimes the best investment a man could make was in another person's potential. In the morning, there would be new challenges, new opportunities, new people to help and territories to develop. But tonight, Caleb Morrison fell asleep listening to his wife's steady breathing and feeling grateful for the night 5 years ago, when he decided that $200 was a fair price for changing the world. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.